Alright, so this is a hopefully quick run through of how to create recurring tasks from a Microsoft form submission, and I'm keeping it very simple, not touching on anything like assignment or bucket selection, anything like that. We're just creating the same multiple instances, iterations of the same task. So uh, kept the form really simple. So I'm asked for task name, start date, which is the date that the first instance of the task will start, a due date, which would be the first instance or the date that the first instance of the task will be due. Um, and obviously, if you didn't want to include a start date, if you just want to have a due date for these, you could delete the start date, not even have a start date question. Um, and then we're basically saying recur each day, week, or month. Uh, Again, just trying to keep it simple. And then the number of occurrences, and I just limited that to 60. So just to be sure that basically, if you go into the, actually, go to the edit form. Um, you can use the restrictions to set this to be a number less than or equal to 60. And the main reason I did that is that we're going to use a do until loop, and the default iteration limit is 60 times for a do until. So just keeping it simple. Um, Again, if you want to make it more than 60 times, then you will have to adjust that limit in the flow as well. All right, so that's our form. And if I preview this, and let's say the task name is mow the lawn, and we're going to start that. Let's say I'm going to require the lawn be mowed every weekend. So the first time it's going to start is June 11th, Saturday, June 11th, and it's due by Sunday, June 12th, because I don't care when over the weekend, but sometime over the weekend the lawn needs to be mowed. And I'm going to say that that needs to be done once a week for the next 12 weeks. No, make it 15 weeks. Hit submit. And that is going to create a bunch of tasks over here in this plan, which is my escape tasks plan. I'm just refreshing there, and we should see in the to-do bucket, there's mow the lawn. Now it does show them in reverse order, which is kind of annoying, but hey, but if we look at the schedule view, we can see that they are properly on the, Friday. Actually, it's showing it as Friday. So set it as the 11th. Oh, okay. Yeah, I forget why this is, but it's because of time zones. But yeah, if you look at one of my older videos in the task creation, I talk about this sort of bug or glitch, whatever you want to call it. So yeah, it's basically just offsetting it by a day. So instead of me, even though I said start on the 11th, it's starting on the 10th. Check the older video and you'll see how to address that. It's Friday afternoon, so I'm not going to bother fixing that now. Anyway, let's take a look at the flow that's doing this. So this is the flow details page. I'm going to go into the edit screen here, and nothing exciting. We've got the trigger for our create recurring planner task. We have a response, got the response details. And then I am initializing 4 variables. There's probably a way to do this without variables, but a more elegant way. But for this particular scenario, variables work, and will do what you want. So anyway, first I'm creating an array variable called task instances, which basically we're going to build this array to contain an item for each task that we're going to create. So essentially, as we'll see later in that do until loop, we're going to add the first task, and then it's going to append to that array, making a calculation for the time for the start date and the due date. All right. So we are initializing that variable and just leaving the value blank. We don't need a value. We're going to fill that in. Then we're initializing a task count, which is an integer variable. It's important that this be an integer variable, and then in the value here we are using the int expression, so int, and then this is we're selecting the number of occurrences. Even though in the form we're restricting it to numbers, the value is still coming into Power Automate as a string, so you need to use the int expression to take that string and cast it as an integer value. So I'll update that. And then we're initializing the var start date with the start date from the form, and var due date with the due date, and those are just string variables. So variable types are important. So task count is integer, start date and due date are both strings, which is again is how there is no date type value. Dates are just strings in a particular format. So string is fine. It's going to recognize those as date values. It'll be okay. All right. So now this is the part where we're building that array of tasks to create. So we are basically using a do until loop, which is going to, you can do until some condition is met. So in this case, we're saying do this until the task count is equal to 0, because what we're going to do is we set task count to be the number of occurrences, and later in this do until, at the end of the do until, we're going to decrement that, so reduce it by 1. So if we're creating a task once a week for 12 weeks, the first instance will be, in the first iteration of this loop, that number will be 12, then 11, then 10, then so on and so forth. So inside of here, I did a compose loop index. So there's a current this dynamic content called iteration index under the do until. Current iteration index, that's the number or the count of the loop that it's going through. And that is important because we're going to need to use that as the calculation for the start date and the due date. Now, I tried doing this without putting it into a compose first, and there's probably a way to do that, but when I try to use that iteration index in an expression, it basically comes back as undefined. So I'm not, again, there's probably a way to do it without this compose, but I'm okay leaving the compose there. That's perfectly fine for me. Anyway, now this is where we are appending to the task instances array, and in this case I'm going to keep every task with the same title or the same name. If you wanted to maybe have it change, like count the number of instances, like task, if the task is mow the lawn, could be mow lawn 1, mow lawn 2, mow lawn 3. You could basically insert that current iteration index into here and it will add that number, but again, we're keeping it simple. Now, start date and due date. This is where we need to do a little bit of a calculation. If I just hover over this, you can see what that calculation is, what the formula, the expression is. And basically we're using an add to time expression, and within that, the add to time expression takes a date time value or timestamp, and then the number of units, the type of units, and then creates, returns the date. So in this case, the first time this runs, the iteration index is 0, so it's going to take var start date and add 0. The current loop index will be 0, and then it's adding, for the last part there, weeks. So it is important that on your form it says day, week, and month, because those are the exact values that need to be put into that formula for that to work. So that's really this is kind of the magic part of it, that, so the first instance, it's going to add 1 day, add 0 weeks. The second loop will add 1 week and 2 weeks, and again, I won't go through all of them, but you get the idea. So you're basically incrementing the date, the start date and the due date, by the number of the current iteration and whatever interval you chose. So that's building up the var task instances, and then we are decrementing the task count by 1, again, to basically cycle this through, so the next time it runs, it will have, var task count will be 1 less. Yeah, you get the idea. So that is the magic part, that do until loop. And apparently you can't do the P code here. Yeah. So P code, just to give you an idea of what those formulas look like that add to time. Now there are also add days, add weeks, add months, etc. Specific formulas, but add to time is sort of the general one, where you need to give it a number, an interval, and a unit. So what number of days, what number of weeks, what number of months, etc. All right. So we're decrementing that, and then I just threw a compose in here as sort of a check so that I could see that output, and then apply to each, which will basically just loop through that task instances array. And again, I threw a compose in here just to view the current item. This was more of a debugging thing that I didn't get around to deleting. It's not necessary, but it was mostly so that I could make sure the data was coming into the loop properly. And then creating the task. This is where it gets you do need to be a little comfortable with expressions, because basically I need to use the item expression and know how to traverse the JSON structure, which sounds much more complicated than it really is. So basically, when we're applying this to each item in this task instances array. So to get the item title, we need to use the item expression. So it's going to be item, open close parenthesis, question mark, which strictly isn't necessary. I just always do it because I do. And then a square bracket, a single quote, title, and single quote, close bracket. So that should be the formula that's in there. And you click OK. Same thing with the start date and the due date. So I'll just clear those out and we'll add them again. And again, it's just item, which is the current item in this instance, this iteration of the array, and then whatever you called that property. So I used start date save yourself a bit of a headache and leave spaces out of those, just to kind of. And when I finish adding these, I'll go back and we'll take a closer look at that array, because I realized I didn't emphasize that part. So again, we'll just do express item. I explained the expression used to calculate those dates, but I didn't really talk about the actual structure of the array. So basically, you're building a JSON array here. So you've got quotes around the property name, so title, start date, due date. So double quotes around the property name, a colon, and then double quotes around the value, and then separate each of those properties. Again, this is a JSON array, which is key value pairs. So title is the key, task name is the value. But the keys and values need to be surrounded by double quotes. And then each property pair, or each set, needs to be separated by a comma. So just important to keep that format, otherwise it'll complain that the JSON is not valid. So make sure you do that cleanly. All right, so, and then I'm just kind of hard coding this to put them in the to-do bucket, and yeah, that's it. So save this, and we'll do one more just so we can kind of see this. So we'll say this is going to be I don't know, wash the car, and maybe this is going to be done once a month. So we will start this on maybe on the last, the first day of every month. So I'll say July 1st, and it'll be due by July 2nd. And I'm going to do that each month for 12 months. And we can submit that, and let's take a look. That's running. It's running. It's running. It's running. Succeeded after a whole 10 seconds. So if we look at this, we can see that in our do until, we've got the loop index of 0 for the first run, and then we're appending wash the car with the date and the start date and the due date. We're decrementing that by 1, meaning it went from 12 to 11. And if we go through, let's say we jump to 8, we'll see that that is going to be 8 weeks out. So it'll be, or 8 months, because we went by month. So that'll be February 1st of 2023. So pretty straightforward now. And then down here we can kind of review this to make sure. So if you do have any weirdness, that's where these compose steps really come in handy to kind of identify what might have gone wrong. If you can see the data, for example, when I first built this, I neglected to include the closing brace here, curly brace, and that was throwing everything off. So I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't had that compose in there. And then in the apply to each, again, we're composing sort of the first instance, the second instance, etc. Again, that's not strictly necessary. It's just a self-check that I keep in there. It's like kind of like documenting your code or commenting your code. So then we're creating a task, and this is the first instance, the next instance, the next instance, etc., etc. If we go over to our plan here and the schedule view, we've got wash the car, wash the car, wash the car. And again, because of that quirk, it's pushing it to the day before. So it's actually putting it on August 31st instead of September 1st. But again, check my earlier video. That'll help make sense out of that. All right, so hopefully this helps. I'm also going to export this flow, which you can then import into your environment and give it a try. Just know that you're going to have to go in wherever the obviously you're not going to have, you're going to have different form values and whatnot, so you'll have to play with that, but at least you could stand it up and look at those formulas to get a sense of how they work. All right, so hopefully this helps, and good luck.